All right, let's see what the nervous system has for us. We're going to learn some key terms and abbreviations and look at the structures and the functions. I've highlighted and read some things that are going to be really important for you to remember for your upcoming test. So the nervous system has two main parts, the central nervous system, or the CNS, and that's central, meaning the middle of your body, and the peripheral nervous system is your periphery, the outer area of your body. And we're going to talk about both of those. And we know that the nervous system senses, interprets, and responds to internal and external environmental changes to maintain the body's, my favorite word, homeostasis. So here's just a little picture of some of the central nervous system. It consists of the brain and the spinal cord. That's central. And the peripheral, I'll show you just a second. This is the peripheral nerve pathways of the body. And so you've got the brain and the spinal column is central, and the peripheral is everything that extends out from there. I'm not going to ask you to memorize all the nerves. Again, the parts of the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal column, coordinate your body's full nervous system, contains the nerves that control the connections between the impulses to and from the brain. So it goes up and down your spine like a superhighway. And then there's the protective covering of the brain called the meninges. The meninges can get infected and inflamed, and the cerebral spinal fluid can get infected, and that results in meningitis. Again, inflammation of the meninges. And that can be lethal, can be viral, or can be bacterial. Hopefully you'll all have had 2 vaccines for that by the time you go off to college. The peripheral nervous system, you have 12 pairs of cranial nerves in your cranium, or in your face and in your head, that originate in the brain. And then you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves that innervate the rest of your body from the neck down. So they act independently from the brain, but they're all involved in the reflexes. I'm not going to make you remember all of the cranial nerves, and again, I'm not going to make you remember all the spinal nerves because we really don't have a chance to implement all of that anytime soon. But I just want you to have a good understanding of some of the key ones that we'll talk about when we do sort of a head-to-toe neurological assessment on patients. So the cranial nerves, there's 12 of them, 12 pairs. Olfactory always relates to smell. Optic, like optician, optometrist, ophthalmologist, that's vision. Ocular motor, ocu is eye, motor is movement, so that controls the movement of your eyes. The trochlear nerve lets you rotate your eyes. The trigeminal nerve, it's a lovely nerve. If you rub your cheeks, that's what gives you that sensation. So you grab somebody's face and it feels so good. Also, it's used for chewing. The abducens moves the eyes laterally. Your facial nerves help you with taste and controlling your facial expression. Acoustic is always auditory, like an acoustic guitar. Glossopharyngeal, that's glossal is always mouth, and pharyngeal is the pharynx area, so that's taste and swallowing. Your vagus nerve is speech and swallowing, and also your upper chest muscle, or upper chest nerves. Your spinal accessory nerves, and your hypoglossal, which helps you move your tongue. So everything kind of from the neck up is controlled. And then there's the spinal nerves, and they are grouped by cervical, which is always neck, thoracic, which is chest, lumbar, lower back, and sacral below the lower back. I do want you to know cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, what those areas are, but I'm not going to ask you what the nerves are that are there. So this is just a little arc that happens when, if you look at the upper left, somebody steps on a tack. That sensory neuron travels, it arcs around through the spinal cord, and then you have a motor reflex to pull your foot off the tack. And that's just kind of the simple way of how the sensory system works to keep you safe and to keep your body in balance. I want you to know the difference between afferent and efferent nerves. In the peripheral nervous system, there's afferent, which are sensory nerves that carry messages from the sensory cell of the body to the brain. So those afferent messages carry messages away from the hot stove to your brain. Efferent nerves carry messages from the brain back to whatever part of your body needs to move. For example, get your hand off the hot stove. The efferent nerve neurons will carry the message from your brain and cause you to know you have to move your hand. So I want you to know the difference between afferent and efferent neurons. The autonomic nervous system, I love the autonomic nervous system. The word autonomic sounds like automatic, and it controls things that kind of automatically that you don't really have a lot of say in. Part of it is your sympathetic nervous system, and the other part of the autonomic system is your parasympathetic. Your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight reaction. Like when I yell at you guys and I say, "Hey!" and then you breathe faster and your heart beats faster and your pupils dilate and your vessels constrict in your fingers and that kind of stuff. That's your sympathetic nervous system, getting your body to react or to flee from danger or some kind of assertion. And the parasympathetic nerves respond to normal everyday situations. So the sympathetic is your fight or flight, and the parasympathetic is just your everyday responses to things. And here's a diagram, if you're a diagram person, for the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which are your motor nerves, your interneurons, and your sensory nerves. So you can see that it's divided into two, and then there's subdivisions. Synapse is a word in the nervous system that you've probably already had where you know there's spaces between your neurons. Your neurons aren't all connected like a chain. There's spaces between some of the neurons, and that is to actually make the impulse move faster. And there's little things called neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine and norepinephrine are examples of them. Those are chemicals that race across the gap between neurons and it's a chemical transmitter of the impulse that helps us to step on a tack and almost know instantly that we have to move our foot, or touch a hot stove and automatically and almost instantly react. So that's the reason we have those synapses, those spaces between the neurons, and why we have neurotransmitters. And again, it's in red, so I want you to know it. And know acetylcholine and norepinephrine and epinephrine are examples of those. So we have, everybody has a brain. If you're living, it's the largest structure of the nervous system and one of the largest organs of the body. It's kind of weighty. It weighs up to 3 pounds. It's covered in dura mater, arachnoid, and pia mater. Those are the 3 layers that we call the meninges. And so you'll need to know those 3 also. And there's different parts of the brain that do different things for you. But it's vital for existence. I'm not going to make you know all of these things on the right-hand side, but this just gives you an idea of where the brain stem, which is in the lower center picture of the brain, is in relation to the cerebrum, which is the whole kind of gray matter top area, and then where the center of the brain, the thalamus, the pineal body, and the hypothalamus are. And here's some information about what all of those things that are controlled by those parts of the brain do. The brain stem itself, again, in the lower center part of this picture, is vital for existence. And when the brain stem is damaged, it can make movement impossible, it can make breathing impossible, it can affect your heart and swallowing and so on. So if people have had a traumatic brain injury and that brain stem is damaged in any way, it could end up in somebody dying, or it could be somebody becomes respirator dependent or something like that. So the brain stem is protected. It's kind of hidden underneath all that gray matter right in the center, but it's also in the neck, and that area is not very well protected. It's one of our most vulnerable areas. We're a really amazingly constructed machine, but we have 2 weak areas, and that's the lower back, because the spine is such a small thing compared to it holding up the rib cage and the head and all of the organs of the gut and of the chest. And again, in our neck holds up our heads, which are 1/4 of our size and are heavy as well. So some disorders of the nervous system. You've all heard about Alzheimer's disease, which is a form of dementia. Those terms are used interchangeably, but they're really not the same thing. A CVA, a cerebral vascular accident, is another term for stroke, and a stroke can happen when there's damage to the brain or a blood clot in a vessel of a brain. Usually it's a lack of the blood flow causes the loss of oxygen, and a part of the brain can die. Or if a vessel ruptures and then there's a lack of blood flow, and then as a result a lack of oxygen. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and Down syndrome, they're both genetic disorders, and I don't think I'm going to test you on those, but they're things you may have heard of. Encephalitis is an inflammation of the brain caused by a bacterial or viral infection or even by a chemical agent. Guillain-Barré, some of you tried to say this in your vaccine debates. Some people pronounce it Guillain-Barré, but it's a French term. It's two physicians' names, Guillain-Barré. It's also called infectious polyneuritis, and it may appear shortly after a viral immunization or an infection, and it can attack the body's nervous system and make walking difficult, breathing difficult. Usually it resolves on its own, but there are chronic forms of this as well. And then a headache that we're all very familiar with, a head injury or any blow to the head. Of course, there's a lot of talk about the concussions and how that can cause permanent brain disorder. I always say one concussion is too many, so avoid them at all costs. Huntington disease is a degenerative neurological disorder that affects the brain, and that is inherited. So it runs in families, and it's a very debilitating disease that happens to people in around the age of 40 and ultimately ends up in death. And so it's not a diagnosis that anybody wants. And we're actually going to do a case study on would you want to know if you were predisposed to a disease like that. Hydrocephalus is when the cerebrospinal fluid is overproduced or isn't absorbed correctly in the circulatory system and collects inside the cranium, and it causes an enlarged head. And that's why if you get to go to a pediatric office or in the NICU, you might have noticed they measure baby skulls because this drainage problem can happen with premature babies. It can happen with regular term babies, full-term babies, and it's just sometimes the system isn't mature enough, or there might be some injury that causes the cerebral spinal fluid to collect in the cranium. And sometimes these poor little babies' heads can be the size of a bed pillow. It's just amazing because the bones of the skull are not knitted together, so they haven't sealed up yet, and the fluid can cause the bones of the skull to expand to really shocking sizes. Of course, you can always have tumors that can cause disorders. Meningitis, I told you about the infection or inflammation of the meninges caused by a bacteria, virus, or a fungus. A meningocele is a birth defect, and sometimes you've probably heard of people talk about spina bifida, where the spinal column tissue and structures develop outside the body, or the base of the spine doesn't close off. Those are called neural tube defects. And meningocele is one, spina bifida. Multiple sclerosis. So our neurons are covered by a myelin sheath. It's like the white covering or the black covering over an electrical cord. We have that in our nervous system too. And multiple sclerosis is a degeneration of that, where you slowly lose your myelin sheath, which causes the impulses for you to move to be impaired. So it can cause people to lose the ability to slowly over time to walk and to move and that kind of thing. Narcolepsy is when people just fall asleep chronically, excessively tired, and they might just fall asleep while they were driving or fall asleep not like you guys when you fall asleep in class. It's different than that, but it's a true disorder. Again, the neural tube defects where the skull and the spinal column develop abnormally. Neurofibromatosis is an autosomal dominant genetic disorder, and Parkinson's is a degeneration of certain brain cells, and it tends to happen with the elderly. And I'm not going to test you on those because they weren't in red. So we're going to talk in a little bit about the sensory system too, and if we haven't already seen that one. But thank you for your time and attention.